Hi guys, I'm Mike, and this is Brain-Splaining, where I explain the human brain in a way that is hopefully easy to understand. In this episode, we're going to be exploring the cranial nerves and their associated nuclei. This is my first episode of Brain-Splaining, so please, if you have any suggestions for future topics, or any ideas on how I can improve, leave those ideas in the comments below. Okay, so the 12 cranial nerves. I have to admit, when I got to this portion of my neuroanatomy class, I found all of this material to be a little daunting, not because there's 12 cranial nerves and I have to memorize them, because that's a fairly simple feat, but also because there's a bunch of cranial nerve nuclei associated with those cranial nerves, okay? So my goal right now is just to present the cranial nerves and kind of orient you to their locations in space, and then give you guys an easy way to understand them, okay, to memorize them. So there are 12 cranial nerves. The first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve, okay? The second is the optic. The third is the oculomotor. The fourth is the trochlear. The fifth is the trigeminal. The sixth is the abducens. The seventh is the facial. The eighth is the vestibulocochlear. The ninth is the glossopharyngeal. The 10th is the vagus. The 11th is the spinal accessory. Oftentimes, you'll see people refer to this as the accessory nerve, so don't get confused. Spinal accessory and accessory are one and the same. And 12 is the hypoglossal, okay? So to memorize these, there's a very common, frequently used mnemonic, and it goes like this. O, 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 to touch and feel, very good velvet, such heaven. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's super helpful. Of course, you can make up your own mnemonic. You can use another mnemonic, or you can use a variation of this mnemonic and change the words to whatever inappropriate word you wish, okay? So to the right, we see the brain stem. So this is a ventral view of the brain stem. Okay, so ventral would be facing your face, facing your head. Okay, so facing your eyes, lips, nose. Okay. Dorsal will be facing your dorsum or your back, okay? So you think of it like the dorsal fin of a shark is on its back. The dorsal view would be facing your back, okay? So on this ventral view of the brainstem, there are a few things that pop out at you, okay? The first thing that pops out at me are these big alien structures here, okay? This is the thalamus, okay, so sensory relay system in the brain. Below that, you have the midbrain, okay, so this is the cerebral peduncles, okay, or oftentimes you'll hear the cerebral peduncles being called the crus cerebri. Those are the same exact things, okay, so two names for the same thing. You'll oftentimes see that in anatomy, okay. This big structure here kind of looks like the top of a mushroom is the pons, okay? So if you look at a ventral view of the pons, it is very easy to tell that this is the pons, okay? Very characteristic structure, looks like a mushroom. Just caudal to the pons is the medulla, okay? So you see the pyramids here off the medulla, the pyramidal decussation being right here where the pyramidal or cortical spinal tract desiccates. Okay, so that's where it crosses, okay, where the pyramidal tract crosses. Just lateral to that is the inferior olive. Okay, so just a tip, we're going to be seeing some brainstem slices later on in the video, and when you can see the olives, that's how you know you're in the medulla. It's a key way to tell that you're in the medulla, because the olives have a very characteristic structure, kind of look like worms, and once you see those, you know where you are. Some other structures that you should note here is the optic chiasm, so where the optic nerve crosses. Okay. Just caudal to that is the infundibulum, and that's where the pituitary kind of branches off the infundibulum. Below that are the mammillary bodies. So you see these two little circles, these spherical structures here. Mammillary bodies, because they look like nipples. Okay, so you could tell that they kind of they have a very characteristic structure. And then here is the interpeduncular fossa. So the interpeduncular fossa, there's going to be some CSF in there, so some CSF residing in this fossa. Okay, so between the peduncles, peduncle here, interpeduncular fossa right there. Okay. So one thing I never actually realized when I was memorizing the cranial nerves is that their numbering isn't trivial. Okay, it's not. Actually, there's a reason for it, and that's because if you look at the brainstem from rostral to caudal, the numbers orient you to the location of the cranial nerves in space from rostral to caudal. Okay, so cranial number 2 is going to be more rostral than cranial nerve number 12. Okay, so looking at the cranial nerves, cranial number 2, or the optic nerve, is right here. Okay, optic nerve. Cranial nerve number 3, the ocular motor nerve, is coming off of the junction between the pons and the midbrain, or the pontomesencephalic junction. You'll often hear that being called. This is also a structure that is very easy to notice, very conspicuous if you actually had a brainstem, a human brainstem in your hands. It's just very cylindrical, little wire-looking things coming off of the pontomesencephalic junction. Okay, so these two things here. Cranial nerve number 4 is coming off over here, and the interesting thing about cranial nerve number 4 that differentiates it from the other 12 cranial nerves is that it's the only cranial nerve to exit dorsally. So you see all of these cranial nerves are exiting ventrally, but the trochlear nerve comes out dorsally and wraps around the junction between the pons and the midbrain. Okay, so right here. Cranial nerve number 5, also very conspicuous, is coming right off the pons. Again, so if you look at, if you had a brainstem in your hand, you would be able to see these large fiber bundles kind of coming off the pons, and that is cranial nerve number 5, or the trigeminal nerve. Okay. So going to the junction between the pons and the medulla, or the pontomedullary junction, as you'll hear that often being called. Most medial is cranial nerve number 6, or the abducens. Okay, abducens nerve here, abducens nerve here. Again, these are bilateral structures. A little bit more lateral to the abducens nerve is cranial nerve number 7, or the facial nerve. Okay, right there. Just lateral to the facial nerve is cranial nerve number 8, or the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay. So I just remember this. I make mnemonics for everything, so this is just going from lateral to medial is just VFA. Okay, VFA, and you could assign any words to that. Okay, so more caudal to that is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay. Just caudal to that is the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve number 10, just these fibers, okay, coming off the medulla. Another interesting thing to note, to be wary of, is that the organization of cranial nerves 1 through 12 sticks from rostral to caudal, with the exception of the hypoglossal nerve and the spinal accessory nerve. So the hypoglossal nerve is more rostral than the spinal accessory nerve, or the accessory nerve. So cranial nerve number 12, for all intents and purposes, is on top of cranial nerve number 11, okay? So you'll see cranial nerve number 12 kind of coming off the pyramids here, and just kind of coalescing right over here, okay? and then the spinal accessory nerve is just caudal to that. Okay, it is the most caudal structure. If you look at the caudal medulla, the very lowest branch of the medulla, that looks kind of very similar to the spinal cord, as close as you can get to the spinal cord without actually being brainstem really looking, is where the spinal accessory nerve kind of resides. Okay, very caudal, and that area looks a lot like brainstem. I mean, like spinal cord. Okay. Okay, so moving on to what these cranial nerves actually do. So there's a mnemonic. Again, mnemonics super helpful in helping you memorize things. So I suggest using mnemonics as many times as possible. So for this, there is a mnemonic to differentiate between whether or not an olfactory nerve has a sensory function, a motor function, or both. Okay, so B being both. So this is also very common. You'll see this all the time. Some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. Okay, so some being olfactory, sensory. So the olfactory nerve helps you detect smells. Okay, plays a role in detecting smells. Optic, also sensory, and as you could guess, it helps you with vision. The oculomotor nerve is a motor, pure motor cranial nerve. And it helps with a variety of things, including controlling pupil size, the shape of the eye, shape of the lens, and eye movement. It controls the vast majority of eye movements with some exceptions. Okay, so you'll see that there are other cranial nerves that control specific types of eye movements. Okay. The trochlear nerve is one of those nerves, and it is also a motor cranial nerve. So it controls downward and inward gaze. So it's often said that the trochlear nerve is responsible for depressing and entorting the eye. So kind of moving the eye inward if you cross your eyes. It's basically what the trochlear nerve helps you do. Okay, bring your eye inward and downward. Okay. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve, and this is a very, very important cranial nerve. Okay. It does a lot of cool things. So it helps with sensation from the face. Okay, so we're talking touch, pain, conscious proprioception of the face, and mastication. Okay, so chewing. The abducens nerve is also motor, and this is one of those that does some specialized eye movement. So lateral eye gaze, so moving your eye outward. It abducts the eye. So if you can remember, this B is pointing away from the A. So it abducts the eye. It pushes the eye outward. So it pushes your left eye left, your right eye right. Okay. And if you have kind of deficits in the abducens, you would have a strabismus. So your eye would go inward. So you would have a crossed eye because you can no longer abduct your eye and bring it outward. Okay. The facial nerve is both. Okay, so it's both motor and sensory. It controls muscles of the face and taste from the anterior portion, anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Okay, so taste for most of the tongue. Vestibulocochlear is sensory. So as you can tell from its name, it has vestibulo, okay, and cochlear components. So hearing and balance. Okay, hearing. Cochlear, vestibulo, balance. Glossopharyngeal is also a both, so sensory and motor. It is responsible for swallowing and gag, and then taste, sensory, from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. The vagus, okay, is both, and it controls both sensation and motor components of your smooth muscle and organs. The 11th cranial nerve is the spinal accessory, or the accessory nerve again. This is a purely motor cranial nerve. It is responsible for controlling your traps and your sternocleidomastoid. So for you gym buffs out there, you know what this does. If you have deficits in the spinal accessory or accessory cranial nerve, your shoulders will kind of droop, okay? So you can actually see clinical cases of this. if you just take a little gander online, okay? If you look at, so cranial nerve number 12 is also a motor nerve, so it's hypoglossal, and it controls the muscles of the tongue. So the interesting thing about the hypoglossal nerve is if you have ablation of any of these nuclei, so they're obviously the nuclei for the hypoglossal nerve are bilateral, okay? You will have deficits in the side of the injury, okay? So the hypoglossal nerve receives contributions from the hypoglossal nucleus. There are 2 hypoglossal nuclei, and if you have ablation of the left hypoglossal nucleus, you will have a pointing of the tongue to the left. So it's commonly said that you lick your wound. So if you have a wound on the left, your tongue will point left. If you have a wound on the right, your tongue will point right, okay? Okay, so I forgot to mention this before I flipped over slides, but so there is a link on the previous slide that has in the bottom right-hand corner that links you to a website that you can actually take a quiz that helps you really associate the various cranial nerves with their functions. So obviously mnemonics are super helpful in helping you memorize these things, but being able to quiz yourself is also very helpful. So check that link out. Also, forgot to mention that you're not going to see any olfactory information in the brainstem because the olfactory bulb is not located in the brainstem. So you're going to see all the cranial nerves 2 through 12 are located in the brainstem. So you don't really have to worry about the olfactory bulb when looking at brainstem slices. Okay. The cranial nerves, each cranial nerve has a variety of nuclei associated with it. So basically axons carrying information to and from the cranial nerves form a synapse first at these nuclei, okay? And so some cranial nerves have one cranial nerve nucleus associated with it. Some have 2, some have a bunch, okay? So again, we're not going to really talk about olfactory bulb because essentially it's olfactory. Its cranial nerve nucleus is the olfactory cortex. Okay, the optic nerve, we're really not going to talk about it because it has its own structure called the lateral geniculate that's associated with it. Okay, so starting at oculomotor, there are 2 cranial nerve nuclei associated with it. So the oculomotor nucleus and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Okay, so Edinger-Westphal. This is just kind of helping you differentiate between motor and sensory. So some of these nuclei have motor functions, some of these nuclei have sensory functions. Okay. The trochlear nerve has just the trochlear nucleus associated with it. Cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve, has the trigeminal motor nucleus, so the motor component of the trigeminal nerve associated with it, and then the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal that is associated with it, okay? Cranial nerve number 6 has just the abducens nucleus associated with it. Cranial nerve number 7 has a bunch, so it has the superior salivary nucleus, the facial motor nucleus, the gustatory nucleus, and the trigeminal nucleus associated with it, okay? The vestibular cochlear just has the cochlear and vestibular nuclei associated with it, okay? Cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal, has the inferior salivary, the nucleus ambiguus, the solitary nucleus. Oftentimes this is broken up into solitary and gustatory, but this is really just one thing, so it's the solitary tract, okay? The topmost portion of the solitary tract is considered the gustatory nucleus. So essentially, the topmost, the rostralmost portion of the solitary tract carries taste information. And then also trigeminal, okay? The vagus has the dorsal nucleus of the vagus associated with it, the nucleus ambiguus, the solitary nucleus, and the trigeminal. The spinal accessory has just the spinal accessory nucleus, and the hypoglossal just has the hypoglossal. So there's 12 strictly motor nuclei, and there's 4 or 5 sensory nuclei depending on how you break it down, okay? So there's a way to actually kind of get an idea of where these things are in space. Okay, so if you can understand what is motor versus what's sensory, you kind of know where they are in a very general way, okay? So there's a structure called the sulcus limitans, and you can actually see it here in this little picture here, and this is the medulla. So the sulcus limitans is this little kind of like invagination in the medulla. Okay, so a little blip that goes inside of the medulla. Okay, it kind of like is a cave. So it's just a concave little structure. Okay, and basically what you'll see is that lateral to the sulcus limitans. So as you get lateral, you'll see that there's sensory nuclei, and the more medial you go, the more motor nuclei you get. So lateral to the sulcus limitans, sensory, medial is motor. Okay, so very medial in this medulla slice, for example, are motor nuclei, whereas lateral are sensory nuclei. Okay. How did I remember which nuclei were associated with which nerve? So I did this by first looking at which cranial nerve had one nucleus associated with it, and then I created a mnemonic based on that. So there are 4 cranial nerves that have one nucleus, and that is HATs: hypoglossal, abducens, trochlear, spinal accessory. And the good thing about that is that the nuclei are all named after the nerve. So the hypoglossal has the hypoglossal nucleus, the abducens has the abducens nucleus, the trochlear has the trochlear nucleus, etc. Okay. Then I memorized which cranial nerves had 2 nuclei associated with them. I didn't create a mnemonic for this because I felt it was pretty simple to remember just off the top of my head. The trigeminal has the trigeminal motor and the trigeminal sensory. And if you remember that there are motor nuclei and sensory nuclei, fairly easy. The vestibulocochlear has the cochlear and the vestibular. It's in its name, so it's simple. The oculomotor has the oculomotor and the Eddie Westphal, okay? Eddie Westphal being the only weird named one here. Okay, so cranial nerve 7, 9, and 10 are the ones that have multiple nuclei, 4, okay? So cranial nerve 7, or the facial, has so far, good, thanks. That was the mnemonic I created to help me remember, okay? So being superior salivary, far being facial, good being gustatory, thanks being trigeminal, okay? And you can create really any mnemonic that works here. I just found it easy because it's kind of repetition. It repeats with 9. 9 is I am so good, thanks. So inferior salivary, ambiguous, solitary, gustatory, and trigeminal. And then 10 is don't ask stupid things, okay? So dorsal vagus, ambiguous, solitary, trigeminal. So I really found this easy. Again, you can make up your own mnemonics, but again, HATs is super helpful because then you just knocked out 4 of the 12 cranial nerves and their associated nuclei. And all you have to do is remember the 8 remaining, and 3 of them only have 2 nuclei associated with them. And then you're left with cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10, which are really carrying a lot of information from a lot of different nuclei. Okay. Okay, so what are we looking at here? On the left, I have a diagram that shows where all of the cranial nerve nuclei are in space. So running from the cervical spinal cord through to the medulla, through the pons, and up to the midbrain, okay? This is a very, very useful schematic for remembering where all of the cranial nerve nuclei are, moving from medially, okay, from most medial to lateral, okay? And of course, these things are bilateral, so all of these nuclei are bilateral, okay? So for example, you have the nucleus ambiguous here, and then just opposite of the midline, you have the nucleus ambiguous here, okay? So these are all bilateral structures. And again, if I'm not memorizing this, I'm just staring at it really just to kind of familiarize myself. subconsciously where all of these things are in space, okay? Now to the right, what are we looking at? Okay, what slice of the brainstem is this? Where are we? This is caudal medulla, okay? And we know we're in caudal medulla because it looks very similar to the spinal cord slices, okay? So if you look at a spinal cord section, it looks very similar to this caudal medulla section, okay? And I know this says cervical spinal cord here, but this is you're going to see in a second that this actually has this is caudal medulla, and it actually has some of the accessory nucleus for the cranial nerve number 11, okay? So for the spinal accessory. So here, basically, this just demarcates. It's the same thing as the last. This is the same slice as the last slice, but just kind of demarcating all of the really important features here. So you see the pyramids here, where the pyramidal tract or the cortical spinal tract flows through. This here would be the pyramidal decussation, so where this tract is crossing. Okay, you can see here that this is the accessory nucleus. Okay, so for cranial nerve number 11. And then you could see the spinal trigeminal tract, okay? So the spinal nucleus and tract of 5 here, okay? So this is all the sensory component of the trigeminal. The important thing about the sensory component of the trigeminal is it's broken down into 3 subcomponents, okay? So the spinal nucleus and tract of 5 is important for pain and temperature sensation from the face, okay? The main or chief nucleus of 5 is responsible for more touch and pressure, okay? Whereas the mesencephalic nucleus is responsible for the sensory components of the jaw jerk reflex, okay? So you could see here that this schematic is actually very, very useful because you could tell that the accessory nucleus for cranial nerve number 11 is located more medial than the spinal nucleus and tract of 5, okay? Which is true. Look at this. You see the accessory nucleus is more medial to the spinal trigeminal tract and spinal nucleus and tract of 5, okay? Okay, so we have a new slice on the right here. We're going to keep this diagram open because it's very informative. Okay, so some structures to note here. You're wondering where the heck you are in space, okay? Where are you? You're located right now in the rostralmost portion of the medulla. And you know you're in the rostral medulla because you can see the olives here. This structure here is called the olives, okay? So it looks like a little tapeworm, kind of just bunched up, okay? Then also you could see the 4th ventricle kind of opening up over here, and you could see some choroid plexus, and that's how you know you're in the rostral medulla. Something else that's important to note is that you can see the pyramids here. They're a little bit more developed than you were in that caudal medulla slice. And you could also see the medial lemniscus for the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, okay? So moving on to the demarcated slice, you could see we'll move from medial to lateral, okay? So the first thing that we note is the hypoglossal nucleus, okay? So we're right here basically. We're catching the hypoglossal, we're catching some vestibular too. So the hypoglossal nucleus is located very medial, right at the midline, okay? Again, this is a bilateral structure, so there's hypoglossal nucleus here, there's hypoglossal nucleus here. Let's say this was the left side, okay? If this was the left side and you had an ablation of the left hypoglossal nucleus, your tongue would deviate to the left. So remember, as I said previously, you lick your wound, okay? It's a very important clinical feature to note, okay? Moving more laterally is the nucleus ambiguus, okay? So some of these structures that we're going to talk about next play a role in cranial nerves 9 and 10, okay? So the nucleus ambiguus 9 and 10. The dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus is just the vagus. The solitarius is 9 and 10 as well, okay? So the ambiguus is located right here, and it's called the nucleus ambiguus, because it is indeed ambiguous. It's kind of hard to find. So if I were to look at this side of the slice, I would not be able to really point it out, okay? Then we're going to move on to the dorsal motor nucleus of 10, okay? So DV here, and that is just lateral to the hypoglossal, okay? 1 over from the hypoglossal. So if you see the hypoglossal, you know that this is the dorsal motor nucleus of 10, okay? Right there. Moving on more laterally is the nucleus and tract of Solitarius. So people kind of say that to remember what this looks like, it's kind of like a donut. Okay, so you see a little black hole here surrounded by white. That would be the solitary nucleus and tract. Okay, so recall that for the solitary nucleus and tract, the rostralmost portion of that tract carries taste information, while the caudalmost portion contains information regarding baroreception and chemoreception. Okay. Moving on more laterally to our friend, the spinal nucleus and tract of 5 that we saw in the caudal medulla section here. So recall it's broken up. The sensory component of the trigeminal is broken up into 3 subcomponents, and this extends a very long ways up the brainstem, okay? So the spinal 5 tract here, spinal nucleus of 5 here, okay? That would be that. And then also in this rostral medulla slice, we're catching some vestibular. Okay, so you can see medial vestibular nucleus over here, inferior vestibular nucleus over here, and I like to remember that it's that the vestibular nucleus kind of looks spotted. Okay, so it's a little spotty. There's some black spots all over the place, and that's how I kind of recall what that is in space. Okay, you can see that kind of reticulated structure. You kind of know that that's vestibular. Okay. Okay, so we have a new slice here. So again, we're asking ourselves, where are we in space? Okay, we're in the caudal pons. We know first that we're in the pons because the ventral portion of the pons, as we saw in the actual brainstem, looks like a mushroom. And this ventralmost portion kind of has a very characteristic look to it, okay? So this look is characteristic of the pons. Once this disappears, you know you're no longer in the pons, okay? We know we're very caudal in the pons because we could see these restiform bodies that are very well developed. So this restiform body is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, okay? Restiform body, inferior cerebellar peduncle, same thing, okay? So moving on to the demarcated image. So if we're in caudal pons, okay, so we're going to see some vestibular, we're going to see cochlear now, okay? We might catch some facial, okay? We're going to skip the salivaries because they're kind of hard to see and they require odd slices, so most textbooks don't really have those. So we're just going to skip them. I haven't really come across them in my studies. So, so looking at this slice here, the first thing we notice is if we're going to be very medial, we're looking for abducens. We don't see abducens. We see facial. Okay, so facial motor nucleus here. We're catching this. We're a little bit too caudal for abducens. Okay, so we're getting facial motor nucleus right here. Okay, and then moving more laterally, we're also getting spinal nucleus and tract of 5, which isn't demarcated here. Oh, actually it is. Spinal tract and nucleus of 5 is over here. Okay, over here, and it would be over here. Okay, so moving just lateral to that. Okay, so facial, then moving lateral to the facial. See how the facial's here? Facial would be here, and then moving just lateral to that, you get the spinal nucleus and tract of 5, which is over here and over here. Okay, so moving just lateral to that, we should get some vestibular. And we do. So we get inferior vestibular nucleus, medial vestibular nucleus. These are over here, okay? The really important thing about this slice that I wanted to kind of, which is the reason why I included it, was because you can actually see cochlear nucleus, okay? So you can see the dorsal cochlear nucleus and the ventral cochlear nucleus. And they're easily observable because dorsal is on top of ventral, and they kind of, they wrap around the restiform body, okay? So if you look at a restiform body, you see that the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei kind of just wrap around it, okay? So whenever you see a slice like this with really well-defined restiform bodies, you know that the cochlear nuclei kind of like are just wrapping around it very nicely, okay? Okay, guys, so we have a new slice here. And as I said before, the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, where are we in space, okay? We know we're a little bit more rostral to where we were before. So we're mid-pontine level, okay? So more rostral than the previous slice. because the fourth ventricle is now starting to close up on itself, and you'll see this closing of the fourth ventricle as you go up is going to become the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so you see this closing off here. See, it's continuous. Also, instead of very prominent restiform bodies or inferior cerebellar peduncles, you're going to see more middle cerebellar peduncles, okay, which you can see over here. Okay. Also, as I said previously, you know you're in the pons, most obviously because of this very characteristic, these kind of bump structures. This is kind of that mushroom part of the ventral, on the ventral brainstem, where you can kind of see that was very prominently pons. Okay, that's this portion here. Okay. Also, the important thing to note here is that this is the level of the abducens. Okay, so again, we moved up before, we could see some facial. Now we're a little bit up from where we were before, a little bit more rostral. You could see abducens because these two bumps here, okay? Just below these two bumps, which are called the facial colliculi, is the abducens nucleus, okay? Controlling the lateral rectus, okay, of the eye, allowing you to abduct your eye, okay? So move your eye away from the midline, move your left eye left and your right eye right, okay? So that's the abducens, okay? This is the facial colliculus, and if you actually to look at a dorsal view of the brainstem, if you had a human brainstem in your hand, you will be able to actually observe the facial colliculi. They're very prominent, okay? So moving on to the demarcated version of that same image. Again, as I said, you could see middle cerebellar peduncle, okay? You see facial colliculus here. Just below the facial colliculus is the abducens nucleus, okay? Abducens nucleus. Again, there's that sulcus limitans, that little bump that goes inward that I showed you before. Okay? So just keep in mind that more medial to the sulcus limitans is motor, so motor things here. So abducens controlling your eye muscles. More lateral is going to be some sensory information, okay? So you see that abducens and very prominent facial here, okay? So you have your facial motor nucleus right over here, okay? Am I getting that wrong? This is the structure right here, okay? Facial motor nucleus, right? Again, you have some vestibular here, okay? So we moved up, we can no longer see cochlear, we have vestibular. So superior vestibular nucleus, lateral vestibular nucleus up here, okay? And again, as always, we're moving, we're continuing with the spinal nucleus in tracta 5. We're beginning to the point where that spinal nucleus in tracta 5 is going to change into the main nucleus, okay, that chief nucleus, okay? So spinal nucleus in tracta 5 here, again, responsible for pain, temperature information from the face. Main nucleus, when we go more rostral, is going to be responsible for more touch and pressure, okay? Okay, so our next slice, we're moving up to rostral pons. Okay, so this is going to be our rostral pons section. Again, you know this is pons because of this kind of characteristic structure here, okay, where the pontine nuclei are. And so this isn't the best slice because here this should kind of be closed up a little bit, and that portion of the pons is kind of cut off. So this is starting to close into the cerebral aqueduct. But I really wanted to kind of get a slice that can show the motor nucleus of the trigeminal and the chief nucleus of the trigeminal, okay? So this is the main nucleus or chief nucleus of 5, and just medial to it is the motor nucleus of 5. So where are we on this diagram? We're literally right here, okay? So the motor nucleus of the trigeminal is going to essentially participate in the motor component of the jaw jerk reflex. Okay, whereas the main nucleus of 5 is going to be responsible for touch and pressure on the face, okay? Okay, so we have a new slice here on the right, and you can tell this looks very different from the pontine slices that we saw before, okay? So where are we in space? We are in the midbrain, okay? We're in caudal midbrain, okay? So caudal midbrain here, so we could see the mesencephalic nucleus of 5. And we could also see the trochlear nucleus, okay? And how do we know that we're in caudal midbrain? So some key things are the inferior colliculus here, okay? So the inferior colliculi play a really important role in audition. And there's a superior colliculus as well that plays an important role in vision that we'll see more rostrally. The reason we know that this is the inferior colliculus is because it kind of looks like a golf ball. So I like to say it's a golf ball on a tee, okay? So it looks like a golf ball on a tee, okay? Actually, you could see here, this is the lateral lemniscus. It's a golf ball. Just kind of rides the lateral lemniscus here, okay? You could also tell that this is caudal midbrain because you have the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle here, okay? So kind of these black fibers here that kind of intertwine. All right, this is very characteristic of caudal midbrain, okay? You could see that in rostral midbrain, where we have the superior colliculi here, the superior colliculus, okay? That this will become the red nucleus, okay? So this decussation here, where these fibers are kind of crossing, will become very distinct, okay? So moving on to the demarcated image, we see that this here is the cerebral aqueduct, okay? So the cerebral aqueduct finally, the fourth ventricle is finally closed up. So we have cerebral aqueduct here, okay? We have periaqueductal gray, okay? PAG, periaqueductal gray. We have inferior colliculus here, okay? Again, it plays an important role in audition, okay? We have the crus cerebri here now, okay? So crus cerebri are starting to form here, okay, where the pyramidal tract kind of goes through, okay? We also have, so we know we're in midbrain because we have a really important midbrain structure, the substantia nigra here, okay, with all that dopamine, okay? Substantia nigra is located here, okay? So the important cranial nerve nuclei that we see are trochlear. So the trochlear nucleus is one of those things that extends. So once we go hypoglossal abducens, now we're on the trochlear, okay? So the trochlear here, again, plays an important role in eye movements. Specifically, it depresses and entorts the eye. It controls the contralateral superior oblique muscle, okay, of the eye. So trochlear nucleus here, bilateral structure, okay? Then we have the mesencephalic trigeminal nucleus, so the mesencephalic nucleus of 5. And it just kind of rides the periaqueductal gray. It is located right here. So if you think of this as an umbrella, the most distal portions of the umbrella are the mesencephalic trigeminal nuclei, okay? So here and kind of here, the more distal portions, okay? So if you're looking at this as an umbrella, very distal. Okay, so on to our last slice. So we have successfully moved from very caudal in the brainstem. So remember, we looked at the spinal accessory nucleus. Now we're moving all the way up past the trochlear to the oculomotor Eddy-Westphal mesencephalic nucleus of 5, okay? So now we know that we're in the rostralmost portion of the midbrain because, as we can see, there's no longer that desiccation of the superior cerebellar peduncle, okay? Now you see the red nucleus, okay? The red nucleus here. Very apparent structure, okay? Now we no longer see inferior colliculus, we see superior colliculus. So it no longer looks like that golf ball on a tee, okay? And you could also see kind of the layers of the superior colliculus are kind of apparent here as well. Okay, there's some layering to the superior colliculus. The superior colliculus is an important visual center. It is important for orienting your head and neck in response to visual stimuli, okay? So moving on to the demarcated image here, you can see we moved up a little bit. So now we're in, again, rostral portion of the midbrain. So superior colliculus here, we have cerebral aqueduct, okay? We have the red nucleus. We also have substantia nigra, as we saw before. We also have the crus cerebri, okay, where cortical spinal, cortical bulbar tracts are descending. So cortical bulbar, cortical spinal, cortical pontine, okay? Now, looking at the cranial nerve nuclei here, we should have oculomotor and Eddy-Westphal. So oculomotor responsible for moving most of the eye. Eddy-Westphal is responsible for pupil and lens accommodation, okay? And then the mesencephalic trigeminal nucleus, okay? So we see mesencephalic trigeminal nucleus is, again, right down here. So if this periaqueductal gray were an umbrella, the most distal portion of the umbrella, okay? The most distal portion of the umbrella is the mesencephalic nucleus of 5, okay? We also have Edinger-Westphal nucleus here, okay? And oculomotor nucleus, okay? Oculomotor here, Eddy-Westphal here. It's kind of hard to differentiate them. They're pretty much in very similar locations in space, okay? So keep in mind that oculomotor, Eddy-Westphal, it's kind of a continuation of this whole along the midline, that hypoglossal, abducens, trochlear, oculomotor, Eddy-Westphal complex here. So as you move from caudal to rostral, you hit the hypoglossal, then you hit the abducens, then you hit the trochlear, then you hit the oculomotor and Eddy-Westphal. Okay, very helpful in remembering where these structures are located in space. And again, so my tips for just remembering where all of these things are is to kind of go through these brainstem slices, go through additional brainstem slices, and kind of compare the brainstem slices to this image here and say, okay, where am I? Am I in cervical spinal cord? Am I in really caudal medulla? Am I in rostral medulla where I hit everything? Am I in the caudal pons where I can hit abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear? Or am I more rostral pons where I could see that main nucleus and the motor nucleus of the trigeminal? Am I in caudal midbrain where I hit the trochlear, okay? The trochlear nucleus, okay? We're responsible for depressing and entorting the eye, responsible for controlling the contralateral superior oblique. Am I in the rostral midbrain, which is responsible for controlling the oculomotor, which contains the oculomotor nucleus, and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is responsible for controlling most eye movements, responsible for controlling pupil and lens accommodation, okay? So that's my recommendation. Just kind of go through this, and if you're not memorizing this, just kind of look at it and kind of have it ingrained or embedded into your memory, and just practice going through these slices and orienting yourself. Ask yourself first, where am I in space? Am I caudal? Am I rostral? Am I pons? Am I medulla? Am I midbrain? Okay, and then what should be here? What should I find here? Okay, so this is our last slice. So this is our conclusion. If you have any recommendations, again, I encourage you to leave those recommendations in the comment section below. Please, any suggestions for how I can improve future videos, any suggestions for how I could improve this video would be very much appreciated. Again, my name is Mike, and thank you so much for your time.